All right, so let's move now into the 21st century. Now, we're 15 years into the 21st century. And certainly, if you think back of everything that's happened since 2000, there is a lot that has happened. But in thinking about, trying to consolidate and look at this over two classes, instead of taking the standard of politics, culture and society, doctrine, and practice like we've been doing, I instead want to kind of give some overviews of where Christianity in its various forms stands in the first quarter of the 21st century. And so instead of moving through politics and culture and society, I want us to think about a variety of thematic ideas instead. And the first place I want to start off with, and probably where we'll mostly spend today, and maybe even some into Monday's class, is thinking about the status of Christianity in the 21st century, globally as well as in the United States. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about is demographics, numbers, percentages. I'm not so interested that you get exactly the numbers or the percentages, but instead the larger trends. What's happening to Christianity? Is it growing? Is it declining? Where is it growing? Where is it declining? And some other things we'll talk about. But before getting into the numbers and percentages and things like that, there are a few areas that I want to kind of set up for us understanding what's the state of Christianity today and why it's arisen. And essentially, we kind of have to start with talking about the transition between a modern worldview and a postmodern worldview. Now, essentially, modernism, which was a worldview, a part of the Christian worldview, but the Western culture especially, had been around since the 16th century and developed in the 16th century, becomes the full expression in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and then into the 20th century. Essentially, the modernist worldview was a worldview where human beings are able to create, to shape the world around them. And ultimately it was believed that human beings and culture were progressive, were positive, were heading to progress. Now, a lot of this is that Enlightenment thinking that's a part of this as well. But modernism also brought with it a couple of other things that were detractors to Christianity. With the increase of the modernist worldview, Western culture became more secular. Now, what do I mean by secular? Well, essentially, secular is often contrasted to religious. And so secular in the sense of something being separated from God. That God is separated from the world. But there's no appeal to the supernatural. And we've seen that expressed in the politics of this time period, right? As we gradually move from the Reformation to the 21st century, we see the increase of governments separating church and state, right? And so the state being run with fewer and fewer appeals to God. And so you see the development of political philosophies of, the consent of the government, right? Government occurs when people agree to have a government, not because God has divinely appointed someone, like you might see in the 16th and 17th century. The modernist worldview also included a component that was heavily naturalistic. Essentially a belief that this world is all there is. And we've seen this too as we've kind of traced the development of science and how science and Christianity or science and religion have gradually been separating since the 17th century. The modernist worldview also tends to be intensely human, in that we see more and more emphasis on the abilities of humans, the sacredness of humans. Again, the rise of individualism would be a part of this as well. Here too, we've also kind of seen a lot of these things being born within Christianity, as individualism, science, and even approaches to church and state are developing within Christianity, but have their consequences of marginalizing or separating Christianity from larger culture. Finally, the modernist outlook also tended to be very optimistic. Human beings are improving, they're progressing, and they can progress. That through our own efforts, through our own powers, we will become a utopian society, a society of great benefit, great wealth, great power. As early as modernism started, there were critics, some Christian, some not necessarily Christian, of this outlook and what it meant for human society. But it's especially the latter part of the 20th century and into the 20th century that you see this optimism starting to break apart. And out of that, a larger critique of modernism as well. There have been a couple of areas that have led to a decrease in people being optimistic about society and human ability. One has been the continued existence of poverty, as well as the widening of the gap between rich and poor. Modernism, the modernist worldview, promised great success for everybody. As we industrialized, and as we urbanized, and as we did all sorts of things through the 1800s, through the 1900s, it was going to be so great for everybody. But it ended up being great for a certain group of people, while others didn't always reap those benefits. And so modernism didn't always better everybody's life. In many places, or in many ways, unfortunately, there were some aspects of modernism that weren't controlled, which allowed people to exploit the system and exploit people. A second area that has led to the decline of this modernist optimistic outlook has been the effect that modernism, with its industrialization, its urbanization, has had on the environment. Whether or not Lynn White was correct that Christianity was responsible for the ecological crisis, as we talked about several classes ago, throughout the 20th century, we certainly see a consumption of resources that is reaching huge levels. It's having a profound effect on the environment, but there isn't that concern until the latter part of the 20th century about the effect that industrialization and certain other types of practices are having on the environment. But a lot of people through the 70s, 80s, even into the 21st century, became more and more concerned about what kind of impact our industrial behaviors, our consumption has been having on the environment. Things like the pollution of waters, the amount of trash, right? So you have recycling efforts in sustainable energy, sustainable food, sustainable forestry, and all those kinds of concerns. But it led to this pessimism about human life. An increase in weaponry, militarism, especially weaponry that can destroy mass populations with one blow, became a concern. And when you think about the spending that was done throughout the latter part of the 20th century, and even into the 21st, on weapons, and we're not here necessarily to debate whether that's a good thing or not. For a lot of people, they became very concerned about how much money was spent on weapons when that money could have been used for other things to better society. And so with modernism came not progress, but the concern to keep what you had and keep other people from taking what you had. Throughout the 20th century, of course, we see the increase in a variety of psychological conditions, depression, stress, eating issues, all very real conditions that people suffer from. but often the impact came from a lot of modern life. And when you think about other cultures in other time periods, you didn't have the same kind of psychological conditions like what we see in our modern life. People probably suffered from depression during the colonial period, but not to the extent and the sizable numbers that do like we see it today in the 21st century. And so modern life for a lot of people has made living worse in a sense of, bringing with it a variety of psychological problems, or aggravating physical conditions that led to psychological problems, right? Because some of these are not just psychological wholly, some of them are chemical things, right? And so the chemicals we have in our food sometimes affect the chemicals that are in our bodies, and all sorts of things coming out of this modernist approach. We can look at the amount of social and economic problems that we have in society. And it's no surprise that when people looked at those kind of things, the rise of crime, unemployment, breakdown of the family, people became less and less convinced that that modernist attitude, this optimism and naturalism, and that was really occurring. Right, so you see a society, especially in the West, that is starting to question the modernist outlook and essentially becoming very, very disturbed by it, very unsettled by it. Another facet of life in the 21st century that is not necessarily with the decline of optimism, but is also an important part here in thinking about the change within Christianity, is the increase of globalization. Now, if we understand globalization as simply the interdependence of cultures, and cultures becoming dependent upon each other, in some sense we could say globalization is a process that has been occurring since people have started being in contact with each other. Some of those very early European explorers, as they traveled to China, as they traveled to the Americas, are kind of sowing the seeds of globalization as they take goods, spices, fabrics, animals from one place to the other. But certainly within the last 70 years or so, we are certainly living in a culture that is more dependent upon other cultures, and other cultures dependent upon us. And when we think about it, there aren't really too many nation states anymore that can survive by being isolated. Now, that globalization, the increase in globalization, has come about by a couple of different means. On one hand, technology has been very important in globalization, or the increase in globalization. But technology has also been a result of globalization. If you think about it, probably a majority of the components in your iPad or your smartphone are not created in the United States. They're created in other places. The brands, the Samsung brand is from Korea. Right? So there's all sorts of ways in which technology is dependent upon globalization, but it also fosters globalization because of the ability to connect with people in other cultures or other places. Right? So technology is a product of globalization, but then also facilitates globalization. Another facilitator of globalization, and also affected by globalization, is economics. They say we are kind of getting out, finally, of all that stuff that began to happen in 2008, when the housing market burst and some other things, the housing bubble burst, and some other things happened there. But we live in a world that is economically dependent upon other cultures. Bad things happen in Greece, and it has a profound effect in the United States. And so when you think about it, there is a way in which there's a lot of companies that are transnational. Right? They might be housed in one place but have markets in other countries. And if a market goes bad in one place of the world, it has economic ripple effects throughout the rest of the world. The final area where I want to talk about globalization, or just kind of briefly mention it, is media. Now, American movies have been going overseas since American movies have been around almost. But we're starting to see more and more media in the United States coming from other places. The prevalence of things like Bollywood, the prevalence of British shows on popular culture in the United States, whether that's transplants or, when you think about it, like a lot of our reality shows are shows that started someplace else that were then brought over to the United States and repackaged. Things like, you remember a couple of years ago, the prisoners in, I think it's Taiwan, who did the Michael Jackson Thriller? It exploded on YouTube, and it's, you know, overseas, but now you can watch it with a click of a button. Right? So media brings us more together and connects us as a world rather than just nations. Globalization has had a profound effect on Christianity, and Christianity has been a part of globalization. Because as missionaries went to other places from Europe or from the United States, they often carried with them Western culture, Western approaches. Now, missionaries today are much more mindful of the impact that that can have, but earlier missionaries often encouraged converts to become more Western in their dress and their worship practices and some other things like that. So Christianity has often been a part of the spread of globalization.